Welcome to our final episode in this series. The last piece of reflection concerns the divine justice and fairness, the very heart of all questions of theodicy. And here we must examine the will of God. It is very tempting to think of God's will in a very narrow way. However, God's will is rather comprehensive. There are various aspects to the will of God. First, there is the active will of God. This is where God performs creative and redemptive acts, Genesis 1 and 2, Romans 5. And sometimes he performs acts of judgment, Revelation 16. Second, there is the permissive will of God, as evidenced in the story of Job. God does allow bad things to happen to his people, and faith requires the acceptance of this aspect of God's will. Third, there is the proactive will of God. God is working to overturn the suffering that is caused through actions that are readily evil or part of sin. Revelation 13 informs us that the plan of salvation was put in place before the actual creation of the world. This means that God prepared a backup plan for recovery should Adam and Eve misuse their powers. And yet, that plan was not evident for thousands of years. Fourth, there is the contingent will of God. Not only does God work to salvage fallen humanity, he also has to contend with ongoing misuse of the powers he has given by every single individual. Even God's people are prone to making choices that are counterproductive. Take, for instance, the story of Hezekiah in Isaiah 38 and 39. A good man, a good king, who in a moment of tragedy refused to accept the original plan of God. And so God allows the contingent plan to kick into motion, but it resulted in even greater tragedy for Hezekiah and his people. Coming to terms with this multiplex will of God provides God's people with options for understanding him. In this way, we may be assured that God is truly with us, that he is just and fair. Comprehending the will of God makes it possible for us to see that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, our Lord. So let's put this all together. The big question: why do good people suffer? Despite several stereotype approaches, the answer to the question is not always forthcoming. However, certain foundational biblical principles may alleviate the pain of suffering and empower those who choose faith on their voyage of discovery. Suffering does exist, and it is the misuse of the powers that God gave at creation that has caused much of the suffering. However, God is still very much in control. God is still very much in charge of his entire creation. Suffering is neither testament to his impotence nor evidence of his non-commitment. In this way, suffering becomes the primary gateway, the hurdle that we must overcome on the way back to God. In order to regain the full use of the powers that he has granted at Eden, we must go through suffering. It is the obstacle that must be breached before victory can be achieved. Most significantly, the multiplex will of God, which operates on so many different levels, demonstrates that God is completely with his people. And suffering becomes perhaps a pilgrimage of faith, an exploration into God himself. Arguably, the way of suffering is also the way back to God. As things stand, goodness is not an antidote to pain, and faith will not immunize us from suffering. However, goodness and faith arm us with the necessary fortitude to walk through the darkest valley without fear. Goodness and faith equip us with the knowledge that even if we pass through the worst storms, they will not drown us, and through the worst fires, they will not burn us. Goodness and faith equip us for this pilgrimage of faith. The Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering, is the path that goodness and faith must tread. But we do not do this alone. God makes this promise: do not fear, for I am with you. Isaiah 43, verse 1. Goodness and faith may not be the antidote to pain and suffering, but perhaps they are good medicine in suffering. Thank you for listening, and God bless.